For 27 years, there was one version of what happened. 19 people left for a school trip. 19 people never came home. Their bus was found abandoned. Their belongings were still inside. And yet there was no accident, no clear struggle, and no explanation for where the students and their teacher had gone. The investigation searched the roads, the woods, the nearby buildings. Everywhere investigators thought the class might have gone. But nothing explained the disappearance. Then, 27 years later, someone opened an old archive box. Inside was a photograph. At first, it looked completely ordinary. A group of students, their teacher, a school bus. But hidden in the background was something no one had noticed for nearly 3 decades. A building that wasn't supposed to be there. And standing in front of it was one of the missing students. A student who, according to the official timeline, should already have been gone. At that moment, the case changed. The question was no longer simply, where did the class go? It became something much more disturbing. Who had been wrong about when they disappeared? And if the timeline was wrong, how much of the original story could still be trusted? The morning of the trip began like any other school morning. There was nothing about it that suggested this would become a day remembered for generations. 18 students gathered with their teacher, Elena Ward, for what was supposed to be a simple educational trip. The students were young, old enough to travel without their parents beside them, but young enough that their families still worried about whether they had packed everything they needed. Parents watched from outside the school. Students carried bags onto the bus. Someone had forgotten something and had to run back inside. Someone else was already complaining about the length of the journey. Normal moments. Ordinary moments. The kinds of moments that only become precious after something terrible happens. Before the bus left, the class was photographed together. It was the final known group photograph. At the time, it meant nothing. It was simply a school picture, a record of a class on a trip. Nobody looking at it that morning could have imagined that 27 years later, investigators would still be studying the faces in that frame. The bus left the school. The trip continued. And sometime later, something changed. Exactly what happened after that would become the central mystery. The class was expected back that afternoon. Then evening came. Still no bus. Parents began calling the school. The school called the driver. And eventually, concern turned into panic. The bus was found near a wooded access road. It wasn't destroyed. It hadn't crashed. It wasn't burning. It was simply there, abandoned. Inside were belongings that made the scene even more confusing. Things had been left behind. But the 19 people who were supposed to be inside the bus were nowhere to be found. The first question was obvious. Where had they gone? The second question was harder. Why would 19 people leave that bus in the first place? The first assumption was simple. Perhaps the class had left the bus because of an accident. Maybe the driver had taken a wrong turn. Maybe someone had become injured. Maybe the students had wandered away and become separated. So the search began. Teams moved through the surrounding area. Trails were examined. Streams were checked. Nearby roads were searched. Abandoned structures were inspected. Every place that could reasonably explain where a large group of people might have gone was investigated. But the search produced something more unsettling than a body. It produced almost nothing. There was no clear trail, no obvious crash site, no single piece of evidence that explained why the entire class had disappeared. Detective Arthur Vale was assigned to the case. At first, he approached it like a disappearance caused by confusion or accident. That was understandable. Investigators begin with the simplest explanation they can support. But the simplest explanation wasn't fitting the evidence. The bus was intact. There was no convincing reason the students would abandon it. And there was another problem. The belongings inside the bus did not tell a clear story. Some suggested the students had left quickly. Others suggested they had expected to return. That contradiction mattered, because if everyone had deliberately planned to disappear, why leave so much behind? And if they had not planned to disappear, what had made them leave? The search expanded. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Still nothing. Eventually, investigators turned their attention to the people who had last been with the class. And that was when the timeline began to crack. The bus driver was Thomas Bell. He gave investigators an account of the trip. At first, his statements seemed routine. He described the route, the stops, the timing, the point where the class supposedly left the bus. But when investigators reconstructed the journey, they found something strange. There was a gap. 22 minutes. 22 minutes that didn't fit neatly into the timeline. There was no clear destination recorded for that period. No independent witness could fully account for what happened during those minutes. Bell said he stayed with the bus. That was his account, but there was no second witness who could confirm every part of it. 22 minutes might not sound like much. In an ordinary day, 22 minutes disappears quickly. But in a disappearance case, 22 minutes can become enormous. Because a missing hour is obvious. A missing day is obvious. A missing 22 minutes? That can hide inside a timeline. It can look insignificant. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Investigators examined Bell's statement. They looked for evidence that the gap was connected to the disappearance. But nothing conclusively established that it was. So the gap remained what it had always been. An unexplained section of the story. Not proof. Not a confession. Not evidence of guilt. Just an unanswered question. And for years, that's where it stayed. Then the case began to cool. Without evidence, theories lose momentum. Without witnesses, investigators run out of doors to knock on. And eventually, the case became one more unsolved file. But the families never had the luxury of closing it. Years passed. Then more years. The missing class became part of the town's history. A story parents told their children. A mystery people remembered, but no longer expected to solve. The families experienced something harder. They could not grieve properly because they never had certainty. There was no final goodbye, no confirmed ending, only questions. Margaret Mercer was Daniel's mother, and like many of the families, she kept the things that remained. Photographs, school papers, small objects that once belonged to someone who had simply stopped coming home. Daniel had been 17, one of the students on the trip, one of the names in the original missing person file. For years, those objects seemed to have little investigative value, until Margaret revisited an old box. Inside was Daniel's notebook. Investigators had not had it during the original case. The notebook contained ordinary entries. School, plans, thoughts about the trip. Nothing that immediately solved the disappearance. Until one sentence appeared. It was short, almost casual, but it raised a completely different question. Daniel had written, "We are not going where they told us." That sentence had no explanation attached to it. Who were they? Was Daniel referring to teachers? Someone connected to the trip? Someone outside the school? Or was he simply talking about a change in plans? We don't know. That distinction matters. The sentence is evidence in this fictional case. Its meaning is not established. It is a clue, and clues can point in the wrong direction. But now the disappearance had a new thread, and there was something else. The final page of the notebook was missing. 27 years after the disappearance, the old school was preparing to organize its archives. Boxes were being sorted. Documents were being cataloged. Photographs that had been stored for decades were being reviewed. One box came from Leonard Pike, a local photographer. Most of the photographs were ordinary. School events, community gatherings, groups of people standing where they had been told to stand. Then came one photograph that didn't seem important. At first, it showed the missing class, all 18 students, Elena Ward, and the school bus. It looked like the kind of photograph that might have been forgotten in a cupboard forever. But Detective Nora Reed, who had reopened the fictional case years later, noticed something. The background. Behind the class was a structure, not a school building, not a bus stop, not anything that matched the location investigators had associated with the original timeline. Reed enlarged the image, then enlarged it again. The structure was old, distinctive, and familiar. It appeared to match a property several miles away, a location associated with Samuel Cross. Cross had been questioned during the original investigation. He was connected to the property. His original account had never produced enough evidence to make him a central suspect. The case simply moved on. But now the photograph suggested something investigators had never seriously considered. What if the class had been there? The photograph didn't prove they had been, but it created a problem. Because the location in the photograph didn't fit the story everyone had been telling for 27 years. And then Reed noticed something even more disturbing. The photograph might not have been taken when everyone thought. The building became the focus. It was an old property located well beyond the area that had received the most attention during the original search. According to the fictional case records, Samuel Cross had once been connected to the property as its caretaker. That fact alone meant very little. Being connected to a location is not proof of involvement in a crime. But investigators had to ask a simple question. Why did that building appear behind the class? Reed compared the photograph with old records. The structure's shape matched. The roofline matched. A distinctive section near one side of the building matched as well. The resemblance was difficult to dismiss. Still, there was a problem. The photograph's existence did not automatically prove the students had been there on the day of their disappearance. Photographs can be mislabeled. Images can be stored incorrectly. Dates can be written down incorrectly. Memory can fail. Even physical evidence can be misunderstood. So Reed did what the original investigation had not. She stopped treating the existing timeline as fixed. Instead, she asked, what if the timeline itself is the problem? The more she examined the photograph, the less certain the original sequence became. And eventually, she found the detail that could potentially move the entire case. The date. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten date. Simple, faded, easy to overlook, but important. The archive had associated the photograph with the day of the school trip. The date appeared to support that. But when Reed compared the image against other records, the certainty began to weaken. The clothing of the students, the position of the vehicle, the environmental conditions visible in the background, the photographer's surviving records. None of these details alone proved anything. But together, they created uncertainty. And uncertainty in an old case can be powerful. Because if the photograph had been taken later than the original investigators believed, then one of the central assumptions of the case would collapse. Daniel could potentially be visible in that location after the class had supposedly disappeared. That would mean the timeline was wrong. And if the timeline was wrong, the original search may have begun at the wrong place. Think about the consequence. For years, investigators were searching for missing students based on one sequence of events. What if those events had happened differently? What if the class had not vanished where investigators believed they vanished? What if the abandoned bus had been positioned specifically to make them look as though they had? That was the possibility Reed now had to consider. Not because she had proof. She didn't. But because the old evidence no longer fit together cleanly. And that led to one of the most important questions in the entire case. Was the disappearance spontaneous? Or had someone created the appearance of a spontaneous disappearance? Once the timeline became uncertain, three major explanations emerged. The first was the simplest. An accident. Perhaps the class had left the bus unexpectedly and something had happened away from the road. This theory had some support. The area was isolated. The bus had been abandoned, and there were no obvious witnesses. But the theory had weaknesses. It could not easily explain the photograph. It could not explain the 22-minute gap. And it could not explain why the entire group disappeared without leaving enough evidence to establish what happened. The second theory was more controversial. Perhaps the students had deliberately left. Maybe they had chosen to run away. Maybe the disappearance had been planned. That would explain why some belongings were missing. But it created another problem. 19 people would have had to coordinate something extraordinary, and there was no convincing motive, no clear message, no established destination, no definitive evidence that the students had chosen to vanish. Then came the third theory, deliberate staging, the possibility that someone had constructed a false trail, that the abandoned bus was not the beginning of the story. It was part of the story someone wanted investigators to see. This theory explained more, but it also carried the greatest burden, because if someone had staged the disappearance, they would have needed access, knowledge, timing, and a reason. There was still no definitive evidence identifying the person responsible. So the third theory remained just that, a theory, not a conclusion. Before going further, look at the timeline. A bus is abandoned. There is a 22-minute gap. A photograph places the students near a different location. and the photograph's date may not fit the official story. Which of those details would you have treated as the most important? Because the next discovery makes all four of them harder to separate. The second photograph was hidden behind the first, not in a secret compartment, not in a dramatic hidden room, just behind another photograph in an old archival stack. And that's important, because mysteries are often not solved by finding something spectacular. Sometimes they are solved because someone finally looks twice. The second image showed part of the same general location, but this time, the students were not the focus. A vehicle was visible. Reed compared the vehicle with fictional records connected to the property. The resemblance created another link to Samuel Cross. Again, it was not proof of involvement. A vehicle can be borrowed. A location can be shared. A coincidence can look meaningful after the fact. But this was no longer one isolated clue. There was the building, the date, the timeline problem, the vehicle, the driver's missing 22 minutes, and now two photographs. Separately, each clue could be explained away. Together, they created a pattern, and investigators began considering a new possibility. Maybe the students had not simply wandered away from their bus. Maybe the bus and the photographs represented two different parts of the same sequence. The students in one location, the bus in another, a gap in the timeline between them. If that was true, the abandoned bus may not have been evidence of where the class disappeared. It may have been evidence of where someone wanted investigators to begin looking. And that changes everything. Reed went back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the investigation. The beginning of the day. The school. The departure. The route. The stop. The 22-minute gap. The point where the original timeline said the students disappeared. Then she added the photographs. The building. The second image. The vehicle. And for the first time, the case could be viewed as a sequence rather than a collection of isolated clues. The fictional reconstruction suggested something unsettling. The students may have reached another location before the disappearance was officially understood. The bus may have been left where it would be found, and the original search may have been drawn toward the wrong area. That would explain why the first investigation found so little. Investigators were searching for people where the evidence told them to search, but the evidence may have been misleading them. The theory was not that the first investigators were careless. They weren't. They were working with the information available to them at the time. A missing bus, a missing class, limited records, few witnesses, and no photograph revealing what would later become the most important contradiction. The cold case had one major advantage the original investigation didn't. Time. 27 years had passed. Documents had survived. Photographs had been archived. Old assumptions could be questioned, and people could look at the same evidence with different eyes. But there was still one missing piece. Daniel's notebook. Specifically, the page that wasn't there. Because the photograph had now become so important that one question had to be answered. Did Daniel know about it? Margaret Mercer had kept Daniel's things for 27 years. Most people would understand why. When someone disappears, objects become a strange substitute for presence. A shirt, a notebook, a photograph, something that was touched by the person who is no longer there. While searching through an old envelope containing Daniel's school papers, Margaret found a folded page. At first, she didn't recognize it. Then she realized what it was. Part of Daniel's missing notebook page. The page was damaged. The writing was incomplete. But one sentence remained readable. A sentence that suddenly connected the emotional story with the investigative one. Daniel had written, "If anything happens, look at the photograph." That sentence doesn't tell us exactly what Daniel knew. It doesn't prove he knew he would disappear. It doesn't identify a person responsible. And it doesn't automatically establish that the photograph was part of a plan. Those would be conclusions the evidence does not support with certainty. But it changes the significance of the photograph. Because now, within the fictional case, the photograph is no longer simply an old image discovered decades later. It may have been something Daniel considered important enough to mention, and suddenly, the opening question changes again. Maybe the photograph didn't solve the mystery. Maybe Daniel was trying to make sure someone would eventually find it. For 27 years, people searched outside. They searched roads, fields, buildings, trails. But perhaps one of the most important clues had been waiting in an old archive box all along. By this point, the fictional investigation has assembled a chain of contradictions. The class disappeared. The bus was abandoned. The original timeline contained a 22-minute gap. A photograph appeared to connect the students to another location. That location was associated with a person investigators had spoken to before. A second photograph strengthened the connection, and Daniel's recovered note suggested that the photograph mattered. Taken separately, none of these clues provides a complete answer. But taken together, they support one powerful conclusion. The disappearance probably did not happen in the simple way the original investigation assumed. The class did not simply vanish from the roadside. The abandoned bus may have been part of a deliberate misdirection. The photographs may represent the class at a different location. And the 22-minute gap may mark a critical moment in the sequence that was never properly explained. But there is still a line investigators cannot cross. The evidence does not definitively identify the person responsible. It does not establish a complete motive. It does not tell us with absolute certainty what happened after the students left the area shown in the photograph. And that matters, because the strongest ending to a mystery is not always a neat answer. Sometimes it is the moment when the story finally becomes clear enough to know which questions are worth asking. After 27 years, the families may not have a perfect explanation. They have something else. A reason to challenge the original timeline. A reason to believe the missing class was not where investigators first thought. And a photograph that may have been hiding the key to the mystery in plain sight. The case began with a question. Where did they go? 27 years later, the more important question may be, who decided where everyone else would look? That is what makes this mystery so disturbing. Because sometimes the hardest cases are not the ones without clues. They are the ones where the clues were there, but everyone was looking in the wrong direction. For the families, the difference between certainty and uncertainty is enormous. For 27 years, they had only the disappearance. Now, they have a new possibility, a different timeline, a different location, and evidence that the original understanding of that day may have been incomplete. The photograph cannot bring the missing people back. It cannot erase the years of waiting, but it can change the story people thought they knew. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of the case. A mystery does not always survive because there is no evidence. Sometimes it survives because the evidence was misunderstood. The photograph was always just a photograph, until someone finally noticed what was behind the people in it. And after 27 years, that background may have become more important than the faces in the foreground. Because somewhere inside that image is the possibility that the truth was never truly missing. It was simply overlooked. After everything we've uncovered, what do you think happened? Was the abandoned bus part of a deliberate misdirection? Was the 22-minute gap the key investigators missed? What does the photograph suggest an entirely different explanation? Leave your theory in the comments. And if you enjoy mysteries where one overlooked detail can completely change the story, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and continue to the next investigation on screen. Because sometimes the clue that solves a mystery is the one nobody thought to look at twice.